Joining me now, former Senator and U.S. Attorney for Alabama, Doug Jones. He's a distinguished senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. And here with me on set is congressional reporter for The Guardian, Hugo Lowell. Thank you both very much for being here. Senator Jones, let me start with you. My Washington Post colleague, Ruth Marcus, writes today that she now believes Attorney General Merrick Garland should bring charges against Donald Trump because, quote, failing to bring them would be more damaging to the nation than turning a blind eye to his effort to subvert democracy and prevent the peaceful transfer of power. Do you agree?
You know, I think that sentiment is growing. This committee is making a compelling case, Jonathan, and thanks for having me this morning. And, you know, look, Ruth also qualified that some. You've got to have evidence that can be admissible in court. A lot that we're seeing in the January 6th committee is not admissible, but it is a roadmap. It is a follow-up. These witnesses are under oath, much like that they would be in front of a grand jury. So I think that there's still work to do, but I think the evidence is growing more and more compelling. There's a lot of issues, and I think that the Justice Department has to take into account. That is the strength of the evidence. That is the fact that this would be the first time in history a former president would be indicted and charged with a crime. But the evidence is growing and the evidence is mounting. It just hasn't been tested yet, Jonathan. And that's one of the things that the Justice Department will do with their prosecutors, with their investigators. They're going to test it from both sides, from the prosecution standpoint, but also as good defense lawyers would test, because we haven't seen any of that with the January 6th committee.
And Senator Jones, Congresswoman Liz Cheney revealed at the end of the last hearing that Donald Trump tried to directly contact a witness who's not yet testified publicly, and that the committee referred it to the Justice Department. This smacks of witness tampering in the court of public opinion. But I guess amplifying what you just said in your previous answer, does it rise to that level in a court of law?
No, I don't. It doesn't yet. And what I think the committee did, Congresswoman Cheney did something very, very important for this proceeding and for the entire investigation, including the Department of Justice. She sent us a warning signal, a shot across the bow that both Donald Trump and any of his allies who may be trying to contact witnesses, letting them know that the committee takes it very serious, letting them know that they will investigate to the fullest extent of the law. And it's also sending a message to other witnesses that we have your back. Do not be afraid to come forward and talk to us, because we've got your back to the extent that we can do it. So I don't think it rose to the level because there was no contact. But at the same time, it was a very serious message that I think was being sent, that I hope will be heeded, because it is one of the most significant things that a committee or a DOJ can do, and that is protect their witnesses.
And, Senator Jones, one more question to you. I want you to put your former U.S. attorney hat on, because I'm wondering, what do you make of Donald Trump's noises about jumping into the 2024 presidential race before we even have the 2022 midterms? Given everything we've learned from these hearings, would such an announcement prevent the possibility of a federal investigation by or even charges from the Department of Justice?
No, not at all. I think he totally, look, when Donald Trump was president, he completely misunderstood the role of the Department of Justice. It was not his lawyers that were there to protect him. They are there to enforce the laws of the United States. And that he may think from a public relations standpoint that people would get scared and back down. That is not going to be the case. These are lawyers that have investigated terrorists who have killed thousands of people. These are lawyers who have investigated the highest crimes and misdemeanors across the country. They're only going to look at the evidence and take into account any number of things that are, I think, are appropriate to look at to indict a former president. But the fact that he may run again right now is not going to be a deterrent, in my opinion, and it should not be a deterrent.
Hugo, let me bring you into the conversation and ask you about the Secret Service story. Carol Leonnig of my paper, who wrote a book about the Secret Service last year, had this to say about the agency. Watch.
They have been accused in the past of destroying records to obstruct a congressional investigation. That's a long time going back now, when in the 1980s, a congressional investigative team was trying to understand how much the Secret Service had been warned ahead of time about assassination attempts, including the attempt that took the life of John F. Kennedy. Critical documents were essentially destroyed weeks or days after investigators sought them.
And so, Hugo, you report that the Inspector General for Homeland Security told the January 6th committee on Friday that the Secret Service's explanation for the deletion of those text messages has shifted several times. Talk about the significance of this.
I think it's really significant. I mean, it started off apparently as it was a software upgrade, and this was why the text messages on the phones disappeared, and then later it was a device replacement program. The fact that they can't get their story straight on something so significant, I mean, these are texts the day of January 5, January 6, the most tumultuous days, close to the insurrection, and the Secret Service now can't account for those text messages that would have described, security planning, how they wanted to move Trump on January 6, how they wanted to move Pence on January 6, and the fact that they don't have an explanation that makes sense is very worrying, both for the investigation and for the members of the Select Committee who think there's something very, very wrong with how all of this has turned out.
Thursday's primetime hearing will focus, as we've now all know, and I said at the top of the show, is going to focus on Trump during the insurrection, what he did and what he didn't do. We all watched it in living color, in real time. So what should we be on the lookout for on Thursday, do you think?
I think, you have to think of it in terms of potential criminal statutes, right? The obvious one that the committee has always said is, was there action or inaction to obstruct a congressional proceeding? And this hearing is going to go to all about the inaction part of that statute, because Trump was sitting in the White House, he was sitting in the Oval Office, he was sitting in the dining room watching the violence unfold. As commander-in-chief, he has an obligation to step in to uphold his duties to the Constitution and to make sure that laws are followed. And the fact that he didn't do that, the fact that he didn't step in, didn't send a tweet, didn't go to the briefing room and make some sort of public address and have these rioters, come out of the Capitol, really speaks to that inaction part, and I think could pose consequences, or the Select Committee thinks could pose consequences if DOJ starts calling on that statute.
Senator Jones, since I don't know if you're a lawyer, Hugo, but Senator Jones is definitely a lawyer, and I'm just wondering to get your reaction to what Hugo just said in terms of what we should be watching out for during Thursday's primetime hearing, and the notion that inaction on the part of the president as part of obstructing a congressional proceeding. Is there evidence there to say, by what he did and didn't do, he's in violation of that statute?
Jonathan, I think that would be a stretch, quite frankly, for the Department of Justice. Yes, he has a duty. You notice that the committee is using the phrase dereliction of duty more and more and more. Well, there is nothing in the Criminal Code of the United States that says dereliction of duty is a crime. It is an impeachable offense. And there ought to be a lot of Republicans in the United States Senate right now going, good grief, if we only had this information. But I think it will be a stretch to say that the fact that he did not stop something that he saw going on would end up being a crime. There is so much significant and compelling evidence of other things that led to that January 6th insurrection and afterwards that I think are the better potential cases if Donald Trump is going to be a target. But the inaction, I think, is really a dereliction of duty. And, Jonathan, there's another thing that I've been thinking about, too, and I don't know if anybody in Congress has ever thought about this, but, there's a piece of this with impeachment that, the Congress, I believe, and I could be wrong about this, you can get constitutional scholars, they could come up with a resolution of some type, finding that he was involved in somehow or a dereliction of duty that would prohibit him from holding federal office again. That doesn't have to be impeachment. I think that could be done a different way. And I'm a little surprised we haven't heard some of that from either the committee or other members of Congress.
I'm going to ask some folks some questions about that, Senator Jones. Hugo, last question for you real quickly. Listening to Senator Jones, it made me wonder, congressional Republicans, we are now 7-8 hearings in where they poo-pooed what these hearings were going to be. What's their reaction to the hearings now?
The reaction, I think, is decidedly muted. I think before the hearing started, there was a lot of, bluster from congressional Republicans and kind of aides to Republicans saying, we don't think that these hearings are going to be a particularly big deal. But then once the hearing started, a lot of that tone has shifted. I think, certain members of Congress that I speak to now don't even want to talk about the 21st of December White House meeting where they met with Trump. They were trying to plan how they were going to object to the congressional certification because they just think it looks bad. Before the hearings, they were talking about it all the time. They were talking about how, they were bragging almost about how their involvement made sure that everything came together. Now you don't even hear about it. So I think that's very telling.